if you were going to take the longer view on this, once this impasse is resolved, however it is resolved, what steps do you envision taking to grant a significant number of people who are currently illegal aliens some kind of legal status, whatever that significant number is, 5 million, whatever? How would you get to that?
Well, look, I don't agree with the premise of your question. President Obama's executive amnesty was illegal, and it was unconstitutional. And I would note that someone who describes himself as a constitutional legal scholar by the name of Barack Obama has agreed with that proposition 22 different times. President Obama said he lacked the legal authority to grant executive amnesty, and then after the election, he said never mind and did it anyway. And for that reason, last week, a federal court in Texas struck down President Obama's executive order as illegal. Texas led the litigation there. I'm proud of my home state for leading that fight on behalf of 26 states. Amnesty is wrong. Now, when it comes to your question, let's take your question at a broader level.
The steps you would take.
Of what we should do on immigration. When it comes to immigration, I am both optimistic and pessimistic, which may be a sign I've been in Washington too long. I am optimistic in the long term, and I'm pessimistic in the short term. In the long term on immigration, I think there is overwhelming bipartisan agreement outside of Washington. I think there's overwhelming bipartisan agreement, number one, that we've got to finally get serious about securing our borders, about stopping illegal immigration, particularly as we see ISIS, as we see national security threats across the globe. The fact that we don't know who's coming into this country makes no sense whatsoever. And I think there is also substantial bipartisan agreement outside of Washington that we need to improve and streamline legal immigration. That we need to remain a nation that doesn't just welcome, but celebrates legal immigrants. You know, I'm the son of an immigrant who 58 years ago came legally from Cuba, fleeing oppression and coming to America seeking freedom. If you want to actually pass common sense immigration reform, the way you do so is you focus on areas of bipartisan agreement. If we crafted legislation that secured the border and that improved and streamlined legal immigration, we could craft legislation that would sail through Congress. That's why I'm optimistic in the long term. In the short term, however, I'm pessimistic. Because President Obama and the Senate Democrats have demonstrated that they have no interest whatsoever in solving this problem. That their object with immigration is to use it as a partisan cudgel. And so it's all politics all the time. And, you know, one thing I like to point out, for the first 2 years of his presidency, Barack Obama had a Democratic majority in the House, had a Democratic supermajority in the Senate. He could pass anything he wanted, as we saw with Obamacare and Dodd-Frank. And President Obama and the Democrats did nothing on immigration. Their object here is not to fix this problem. Their object here is to play politics and demagogue in the Hispanic community. It's cynical, it's wrong, it's irresponsible. It also illustrates, I don't think we're going to see meaningful progress on immigration as long as President Obama's in the White House, but I think with a Republican president in the White House in 2017, we will be able to see real leadership to come together on areas of bipartisan agreement to actually fix this problem.
And on that, if you were the Republican nominee, it's likely Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. What strength do you have to defeat her?
Look, I think it is a great question. I agree with you that Hillary is likely to be the Democratic nominee. And I'll tell you, I'm optimistic about 2016. And let me tell you both what I think Hillary Clinton's greatest strength is and why I believe we're going to win in 2016. Hillary's greatest strength, I believe, is Bill Clinton. And I don't mean as a surrogate. I believe Hillary is going to embrace Bill. And she is going to use Bill to tell the story that she is somehow more moderate than Obama. Now, I don't think that's remotely true. I think Bill Clinton is genuinely more moderate than Obama. But I think Hillary is every bit as radical as Barack Obama. But her story, and her story will be a good one, will be harken back to the 1990s, when we had prosperity, when there was peace in the world, and frankly, when Democrats were competent. Look, that's a good narrative. As conservatives, we underestimate that at our peril. We need to be prepared to take that head on. So why is it that I'm optimistic? I believe if Republicans nominate a strong conservative with a positive, optimistic message, we will win in November. And we'll win for 3 reasons. Number one, the natural cyclical nature of American politics. Since World War II, we've consistently gone 2 terms one party, 2 terms the other, 2 terms one party, 2 terms the other. The only exceptions are with a fantastic president like Ronald Reagan, you get a 3rd term for the vice president. And with a horrible president like Jimmy Carter, you only get 1 term. If you take those exceptions out, it has been like clockwork. The data show for every term a party's in office, they lose 1.5 points of the popular vote. But secondly, the Obama record is substantively indefensible. It is a manifest disaster. We should have won in 2012 based on how bad the record is. Now, Hillary will try to run away from it. But domestically, the domestic issue Hillary Clinton is most associated with is Hillary Care, the obvious predecessor of Obamacare. Any competent Republican will not let her run away from the train wreck that is Obamacare. And then when it comes to foreign policy, look, she owns the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. She designed and implemented leading from behind, and the whole world is on fire right now. But the 3rd reason that I am so optimistic about 2016 concerns the underlying narrative. You know, before I was in the Senate, I was a Supreme Court litigator. What I did for roughly a decade was represent the state of Texas, represent major corporations before the U.S. Supreme Court in critical litigation. And I would focus on every issue from the perspective of framing the narrative. Sun Tzu famously said, every battle's won before it's fought. It's won by choosing the terrain on which the battle will be fought. The narrative of the Democrats in the last 2 elections was Republicans are a bunch of rich, out-of-touch aristocrats who don't give a flip about working men and women. And by the way, Mitt Romney enjoys firing. That is a powerful narrative. It's a dangerous narrative. We have the opportunity to completely invert that, to flip it on its head. Since leaving office, Bill and Hillary Clinton have made hundreds of millions of dollars exploiting their government service. Hillary Clinton embodies the bipartisan corruption of Washington, where those who walk the power, the corridors of power in the Obama administration, they've gotten fat and happy. The top 1% today earn a higher share of our national income than any year since 1928. The way we win in 2016, I believe, is to run a populist campaign fighting for working men and women, the people who've gotten hammered under the Obama economy. We've got the lowest labor force participation since 1978. Median wages have stagnated. They're at the same level they were in 1995. If we run a populist campaign for working men and women against the corruption of Washington, that's how we win. But I also think the way we win is what Ronald Reagan told CPAC 40 years ago. We win by painting in bold colors and not pale pastels.
You say we like the Republican Party, but do you mean we like Cruz, the Cruz crew?
I mean we even more fundamentally as conservatives and Americans.
So on Hillary, do you think her practice of taking money from Arab governments put us at greater risk of terrorism?
I think the record of Mrs. Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, of taking millions from governments all over the world is real cause for concern. It is a manifestation of the crony capitalism we have seen for decades. So many people across this country are frustrated out of their minds with Washington. with career politicians in both parties. Because it seems no matter who you vote for, government keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The debt gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Our liberties recede more and more and more. And Hillary Clinton embodies that. The only way to turn this country around, I believe, is to stand with the American people against Washington, against the ever-growing leviathan of government power, and to bring power back to the American people. And when you have a candidate who, while she was serving as Secretary of State, her husband gave speeches all over the world, being paid millions of dollars from foreign governments, from foreign corporations, while she's serving as Secretary of State. Call me crazy. I don't think the Secretary of State, or for that matter, the President, should be on the payroll of foreign nations.
Senator, in focusing on our own party now towards 2016, the way that the system is set up for the primaries, it seems like we have a 4-lane highway merging into 1 lane. How do we get to the candidate that you were talking about earlier with the system in place that we have now? And is it possible to get that sort of candidate?
Well, the hope of a great many consultants in Washington is that conservatives will divide. All the men and women who are here at CPAC, the Washington consultants' dream is for a slice of them to go to one candidate, a slice of them to go to another candidate, for libertarians to go over here, for evangelicals to go over here, for conservatives to go over here, for Tea Party to go over here, because that's how they run through with the same candidates. They keep running year after year after year and keep losing year after year after year. I think it's critical that conservatives unite. And let's talk a minute about how we do that. Every one of us here is well aware that politicians don't always tell the truth, to put it mildly. I know that's a shocking image.
I wish you told us to sit down first.
Yeah, you got me there.
And so how do we, as primary voters, distinguish? In 2016, we're going to have a lot of candidates running. Now listen, there are some terrific people that are looking at this race. There are people that are inspirational. There are people who are wonderful speakers. There are people who I admire. Every single one of them is going to say they're the most conservative person to ever live. I promise you, you're not going to have a single candidate stand up on the stage at CPAC and say, I'm a squishy establishment moderate who stands for nothing. They're not going to say that.
What about Jeb? You had to think about it. It's funny.
He's diplomatic.
I'll let his words speak for himself. So how do we distinguish? If everyone says the same thing, we've been burned before. We've supported candidates who sound great, get in office, and don't stand for the principles. What I would suggest to every Republican primary voters, what I'm going to suggest at CPAC this afternoon, is we say to every candidate, don't tell me, show me. You say you believe in these principles. Show me where you stood up and fought for them. Show me where you bled for them. Show me what you've accomplished. So if a candidate says they oppose Obamacare, great. Show me where you stood up and fought to stop it.
Amen.
If a candidate says they oppose President Obama's illegal executive amnesty, wonderful. Show me where you stood up and fought to stop it. If a candidate says they support the First Amendment, freedom of speech, religious liberty, if a candidate says they support the Second Amendment, our right to keep and bear arms, show me where you stood up and fought to protect them. If a candidate says they oppose the debt ceiling and out-of-control debt that's bankrupting our kids and grandkids, show me where you stood up and fought to protect them. If a candidate says they support life and marriage, show me where you stood up and fought to protect them. If a candidate says they stand for Israel, if a candidate says that they will stand against Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability, show me where you stood up and fought to protect them. The scripture tells us, you shall know them by their fruits. And that's the test I hope every primary voter, every caucus goer applies to every one of us. And I would encourage you, ask of the candidates, including me, ask that question. Don't tell me. Show me. If you say you oppose Common Core, show me where you've stood consistently against Common Core. That's how we tell the difference between who's walking the walk and who's just talking at the talk.
It's funny, because in 2012, Jeb Bush actually said that the Republican Party was no place for Ronald Reagan. He would not have been elected as conservative. The RNC is completely split right now, and you are seen as truly the face of the alt-right. They say that makes you basically polarizing. My question for you, Jay, is the RNC really as polarizing as we think it is, and how can you unite everybody behind you?
Look, we have to reassemble the old Reagan coalition, and the only way to do that is to bring together fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, and national security conservatives. If we just have one or two legs of the traditional Republican stool, we will lose. We don't get to 51%. Which means you need a candidate who not only will stand strong on economic growth, but also is willing to stand up for life and marriage. It means you need a candidate who not only will fight for our constitutional liberties, but also will lead in stopping ISIS and a nuclear Iran. And the Washington consultants embrace what I call the Washington fallacy, which is they view voters as a spectrum from right to left. And they believe if your opponent is here, the way you win is you go infinitesimally to the right, so that you capture every marginal voter right up until where they are. And you can understand that in theory, that's not a crazy idea. The problem is, every single time we do it, millions and millions of people over here stay home. And so we don't have to ask theoretically, is that a winning strategy? We've tested it. We've tested it over and over and over again. So the Washington consultants, they say, we've got to nominate a Bob Dole. He's the only candidate who can win. We've got to nominate a John McCain. He's the only candidate who can win. We've got to nominate a Mitt Romney. He's the only candidate who can win. And every time we do that, millions of people stay home. If we want to win in 2016, and listen, I think the most critical question, if we're going to save this country, is how do we win in November 2016? If you compare 2004, the last election we won, to 2008 and 12, by far the biggest difference is the millions of conservatives that showed up in 04, that stayed home in 08, and even more stayed home in 12. And they fall into two categories. Number one, evangelical Christians. Showed up in massive numbers in 04 and have stayed home the last two election cycles. And number two, Reagan Democrats. They tend to be ethnic Catholics, up and down the Rust Belt, blue-collar union members, gun owners, pro-life, strong national defense, Ohio steelworkers. If we're going to win in 2016, we have to bring those voters back. And if we nominate another candidate in the mold of a Bob Dole or a John McCain or a Mitt Romney, and let me be clear, those are good, they're honorable men, they love their country, but what they did didn't work. It's a losing strategy, and if we nominate another candidate in that mold, the same voters who stayed home in 08 and 12 will stay home in 16, and Hillary Clinton will be the next president. So how do we win? We need to look for a candidate who can energize and mobilize those millions of conservatives and bring them back. And I'll make a final point that's a little bit counterintuitive. When you do that, when you don't run side by side, but when you draw a line in the sand, when you make a fundamental choice, two things happen. One, you turn out the base in massive numbers. But two, and this confounds every Washington pundit, that's also when you earn crossover votes. In the last 50 years, there's only one Republican who has a group of Democrats named after him. Reagan Democrats. And if you think about it for a minute, you can understand why. Scotty, let's say you're a Democrat. But let's imagine you're a Democrat.
We're imagining.
You're going in to vote. And the two vote candidates are neck and neck. They're indistinguishable. What are you going to do? You're going to vote for the Democrat. That's your team. You might as well. They're basically the same thing. In 1980, Ronald Reagan didn't stand up and say, you know, I'm just like Jimmy Carter. He drew a line in the sand. He said, this is a fundamental choice about the direction of this country. And what happened was millions of FDR Democrats, who'd been Democrats for generations, they came in and they said, wait a second. Those are my values. Suddenly they had a reason to cross over. And so the way we win is we've got to bring the conservatives back and we've got to paint a clear, optimistic vision. There is a better way to reignite the miracle of America. I think that's the path to victory.
Who's the best at doing that right now?
Senator, can we get some breaking news real quickly on Loretta Lynch, who's just been confirmed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee? First of all, did you vote for her? Second of all, I think I know the answer, but second of all, what do you think about her being confirmed by the now Republican-controlled Senate Committee?
For conservatives who would very much like to see Republicans do what we said we would do, this has been a tough week. In this week, we've seen leadership join with Harry Reid to say, we're not going to stop executive amnesty. And at the exact same time, we've seen leadership move forward with confirming a nominee for Attorney General who told the Senate Judiciary Committee she will continue President Obama's lawlessness. I think this is wrong. And I think it's heartbreaking. You know, if you go back to the confirmation hearing, entering the hearing, I actually wanted to support Ms. Lynch's nomination. For 6 years, Eric Holder has been the most partisan Attorney General we have ever seen. He has abused the office. He has undermined its bipartisan tradition of faithfulness to the law. And I had hoped that Ms. Lynch would prove to be a relatively no-nonsense prosecutor who would uphold the law. I would have happily voted to confirm a nominee who fit that mold. At the hearing, however, Ms. Lynch's answers were brazen. When asked how she would differ from Eric Holder, Ms. Lynch could identify no way whatsoever. When asked if she would implement President Obama's illegal and unconstitutional executive amnesty, she said absolutely. And she said she found the legal reasoning, quote, reasonable. When asked about the dubious legal theory that the president put forward to justify this prosecutorial discretion, when she was asked under that theory, would President Obama have the authority to grant amnesty to all 12 million people here illegally, she refused to answer that question. When she was asked, would prosecutorial discretion allow a subsequent president to instruct the Treasury Secretary to no longer collect any income taxes in America above 25%? She refused to answer that question. When she was asked if prosecutorial discretion would allow a subsequent president to instruct the federal government to no longer enforce a single federal labor law or environmental law against the state of Texas, she refused to answer that question. When asked if she agreed with the Holder Justice Department's position that the government could put a GPS sensor on the automobile of every single American with no probable cause whatsoever, a position that was rejected unanimously by the U.S. Supreme Court, she refused to answer that question. When asked if she agreed with the Holder Justice Department that a church or synagogue has no First Amendment protection in its authority to select its pastor or priest or rabbi, a position that was also unanimously rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court, she refused to answer that question. When asked if the Constitution allows the federal government to use a drone to kill an American citizen on American soil if that person poses no imminent threat, at the hearing she refused to answer that question. The hardest thing any Attorney General has to do is stand up for the Constitution and rule of law against the President who appointed him. We have seen Attorneys General in both parties do that. Elliot Richardson stood up to Richard Nixon and appointed Archibald Cox to investigate the credible allegations of abuse of power. Janet Reno stood up to Bill Clinton and appointed Robert Fisk. When Ms. Lynch was asked if she would follow that bipartisan tradition and appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the IRS's abuse and targeting of citizen groups, and remove it from a major Democratic donor who is currently leading the so-called investigation? She refused to answer that question. This morning, before coming over to CPAC, I urged my colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee, I said, listen, when Eric Holder has engaged in lawlessness, he did so after being confirmed. He did so after assuming the job of Attorney General. In this instance, Ms. Lynch has looked us in the eyes and she's told us this is what she's going to do. She has told us she will implement and enforce no restrictions whatsoever, no limits on the authority of the President. And I urged my Republican colleagues, I said, listen, any one of you that votes yes, you have no ground to complain if the President comes back and grants amnesty to 12 million people next time. Because she's told you she will rubber stamp that. You have no ground to complain in the next 20 months when we see executive abuse of power, one after the other, and the Department of Justice just becomes a rubber stamp for every one of us, because she has told us this. And so I'm sorry to say that leadership rejected my entreaties and rejected honoring the commitments we made to the men and women who elected us by choosing to move this nomination forward. And by doing so, any Republican who participates in that is complicit in the lawlessness.
So, Senator, excuse me, there's a little bit of time between now and 2016 for that election, with all due respect. So how are we going to stop this runaway train? I'm from Oklahoma. We have a 50,000 member militia, and that's just the people who raise their hands. There's a lot of sabers that are rattling. What can you tell them?
The next 20 months are going to be very dangerous. They are going to be dangerous at home. President Obama has reacted to this last election in a way that's unprecedented. You know, prior presidents have been repudiated at a midterm election, a second term. And they've reacted with contrition. They've said, okay, I've heard the voice of the American people, I'm going to change path. President Obama instead reacted with anger and defiance. He's essentially told the American people, go jump in a lake. I believe the next 20 months we are going to see a degree of lawlessness that will exceed anything we've seen in the previous 6 years. I think we're going to see executive order after executive order. I think we're going to see the abuse of regulations in a way that crushes small businesses, destroys jobs. I think we are going to see the continued weaponization of the IRS and the federal government. And it is going to be dangerous. Now, it is my hope that Republicans in Congress will do everything we can to rein in that abuse of power and to provide meaningful oversight.
If you'll be aggressive, you'll win.
It is certainly my intention to do everything humanly possible to do that. And I'll tell you, as dangerous as it is going to be here at home, it's going to be even more dangerous abroad. Every bad actor on the face of the globe, from Putin to Khomeini in Iran to ISIS, has every incentive possible to do as much damage as they can in 20 months, because the tyrants of the world believe there is no credible threat or deterrent from this president. And so the only limit on the murder and repression and mayhem they cause is the limits of their power. So how do we respond to it? If you look to Washington for hope, you'll be demoralized. Washington is fundamentally broken, and the answer won't come from Washington. But I often invoke history as a guide. As the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are is very much like the late 70s. It's very much like 40 years ago when Reagan said, paint in bold colors, not pale pastels. I think the parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. And I believe 2016 will be an election like 1980. That the way we win is not Washington. If you think about Reagan, in the late 70s we saw a grassroots movement of millions of men and women who came together and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Reagan. It's worth remembering, in '76, Reagan primaried Gerald Ford the sitting Republican president. You want to make Republican leadership in Washington loathe you. Come within an inch of toppling the incumbent Republican president. Now, Reagan wasn't mean-spirited about it. He didn't attack Ford personally, but he said we need to stand for something. We need to stand for freedom, for the Constitution. We need to stand up against the Soviet Union. We need to get back to core principles. So in 78, 79, Ronald Reagan didn't get on a plane and fly to Washington and sit down with all the senior Republicans in the House and Senate and convince them, come on guys, find a backbone. He knew that was hopeless. Instead, what Reagan did is he took the case to the people. He took the case to the people, and we saw a grassroots movement that rose up like a tidal wave and swept into this country. And tremendous things happened. We went from stagnation to booming economic growth. Millions of people lifted out of poverty and into prosperity. We went from our hostages languishing in Iran for 444 days to their being released the day Reagan was sworn in, and to winning the Cold War and tearing the Berlin Wall to the ground. That's what's possible. And so your real question, how do we stop it? We ain't going to stop it in Washington. And if we're counting on Washington politicians to do it, it will not work. It's why my attention is not focused on Washington. My attention is doing everything humanly possible to energize and mobilize the grassroots across this country. It is only if we bring power out of Washington and back to we the people, that's how we turn the country around. And a final point. I am unbelievably optimistic. One of the real blessings of serving in the Senate is that I get to travel the state of Texas. I get to travel the country. I get to see what's happening. People are waking up. Sometimes things have to get really bad to startle people out of their slumber. People are waking up. People who over and over again had never been involved in politics. Let me tell you two closing anecdotes. Several months ago, I was down in Sarasota County, Florida, speaking to the Republican Party there. And the county party had invited me there, and the county chairman was talking to a reporter at their event. And he said, look, Sarasota County is a very moderate county. It's a very establishment county. He said, Sarasota County is no Tea Party hotbed. He said, we invited Cruz. Figured we'd get a couple hundred people at a good little event. They had over 2,000 RSVPs. The event was standing room only, and my favorite comment was at the event, the county chairman turns to the reporter, he's looking around the room, and he says, who the hell are these people? A whole lot of people in the room he'd never seen before. What happened in the Reagan Revolution was millions of people who hadn't been involved stepped up and said, what is happening to our country, let's get back to the common sense principles it was built on. A final story I want to tell you. Several months ago, we were in California, and a young woman there brought a poster that she asked me to sign to her friend Kristen. And it was Kristen's birthday. She said, would you write happy birthday, Kristen? I said, yeah, sure. So I was writing happy birthday, Kristen. She said, let me tell you about Kristen. I said, okay. She says, Kristen is a liberal Democrat. She said, I called Kristen a couple of weeks ago, and Kristen told me, I picked my horse for 2016. She said, okay, great, so you're supporting Hillary? And she said, no, I'm supporting Cruz. She said, what, Kristen, what are you talking about? You are a liberal California Democrat. And Kristen responded, she said, you know, I just got my health insurance bill. I can't afford Obamacare. And I think he's the only guy that'll actually repeal the damn thing. If we want to win, we need to tell the truth and we need to do what we said we need to. It's not complicated, but it's powerful. If we stand with the American people against the corruption of Washington, that's how we turn the country.